UUC friends. It's my great pleasure to join you again for another Sunday morning. I thank Judy Turnipseed, Phil Turner, Richard McLeod, your Reverend Stephen Robinson, and all the members of your UUC Worship Committee for extending this invitation. I consider myself to be an itinerant visitor to your congregation, and today you have blessed me again by asking me to be a very itinerant preacher. By the way, you're one of the only stops on my circuit. But I keep coming back because of the open hearts and minds of this congregation. And I am so glad that given all that we have endured during this COVID-19 pandemic, that you are here going strong. We desperately need your light, your empathy, and your continuous seeking of social justice deeds, not hypocritical creeds. And I especially say this as a progressive Christian and a fellow traveler. Now, you may or may not wonder why I, a political scientist, am coming before you to talk about the brilliance of an African-American woman novelist, Octavia E. Butler. First of all, I'm a science fiction fan or nerd. After all, I was a 12-year-old kid who wept after seeing Star Wars for the first time. Maybe that's too much information. But as a sci-fi nut or fanatic or fan, this semester is true for previous semesters. I have taught a course entitled Race and Science Fiction. Now, one definition of science fiction is that it's a form of storytelling based on imagined possible futures, scientific or technological advances, and major social or environmental changes, frequently portraying space or time travel or life on other planets. But in my view as a social scientist, science fiction is an absolutely wonderful genre of storytelling for exploring serious political, social, and cultural themes. But secondly, and more importantly, I'm coming before you today because Octavia Butler is one of my all-time favorite writers and science fiction writers, who I believe very firmly illuminated our times, that she is almost sort of prescient, or dare I say prophetic. And like your chalice lighting each Sunday in the dark times of this pandemic, which I pray are beginning to end, I am sharing with you the light. I'm sharing with you her light, her vision. She, a science fiction novelist who's given a ray of hope to me and to others. Today, I share the spiritual insights of her Earth-Seed duology. Now, the first book is The Parable of the Sower, and was written in 1993, shortly after the period of the Rodney King verdict and the Los Angeles rebellion that stemmed from it. The second book is The Parable of the Talents, and it was written in 1998. As a scholar who studies African-American political life and US racial and ethnic politics, I say these books are not simply insightful, but they're prescient in that they tell us, among other things, Butler's vision, her projection of what life would be like in the very period in which we are living, the 2020s of America. They are written as a cautionary tale, her precise words, to warn us that if we do not grapple with the multiple crises that we confront, the climate crisis, the abuse of the environment, the drug war, and unequal policing of crime, brutally unequal systems of public education, poverty, disease, white nationalism and racism, sexism and misogyny, among other ills, if we don't deal with these, there can one day be a reckoning. My main point of my sermon comes from Octavia Butler's protagonist in these novels, a young Black woman by the name of Lauren Oya Olamina, whose religion of Earthseed foremost believes God is change. Olamina's husband, Franklin Bancoli, once adeptly described Earthseed as God is change. Some of the faces of Olamina's God are biological evolution, chaos theory, relativity theory, the uncertainty principles, and of course, the second law of thermodynamics. He quotes from the scripture, God is change, and in the end, God prevails, unquote. Now he says, Earthseed is an impersonal, but not a fatalistic belief system. God can be directed, focused, speeded, shaped. all things change, but all things need not change in all ways. God is inexorable, yet malleable. Odd, hardly a religion at all. It sounds like Olamina is a Unitarian Universalist, right? And I'll ask you, are there Olaminas among you today? In short, we can be agents of or actors for social change and not just a passive audience. So first, let me talk about Octavia Butler's life and work. Then I will share insights from her Earthseed books, focus upon most particularly the second book, the Parable of the Talents, and then conclude with her grounded prescience and how it should be a guide to those of those of us who believe in freedom. For we all can be politically prescient if we choose to be. Octavia Butler, she lived between 1946 and 2006. She combined various science fiction and speculative motifs, technology, Black and African spiritualism, mysticism, the occult, dystopia, and mythology. She combined all these things within a Black feminist lens to seamlessly comment on racism, xenophobia, sexism, and past as well as future possibilities. She saw herself as a Black science fiction writer, but she's often credited as the mother of Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is a Black-centered cultural movement that draws from Black/African diasporic culture and history to imagine and reimagine the past, present, and future. According to Ytasha Womack, the author of the book Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, Afrofuturism combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, Afrocentricity, and magic realism with non-Western beliefs. Now, if you've seen the 2008 Marvel film by Ryan Coogler, Black Panther, how many have seen that film? Then you've seen an example of Afrofuturism. If you want to have a fun Saturday or Sunday, go check out that film. Now, relevant to today's sermon, Womack says Butler's religious metaphors, that there's a central feminine narrative to these metaphors, and their use of the African diasporic mysticism and the transformative power of love are tenets that many Afrofuturists weave into their work. She gave many women a voice and validated their mashed up feelings of women's issues, race, sci-fi, mysticism, and the future, unquote. Award-winning sci-fi author Nnedi Okorafor is a true Butler fan. And she said, quote, I was writing these things and I didn't realize that what I was writing could be published until I read Octavia Butler. And just more evidence of her influence is this book that is an audited volume entitled Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements by Brown and Amarissa. So if you're interested in the short stories, it's inspired by Octavia Butler. Here, I'll refer that book to you. With family roots in Louisiana, Butler was born in Pasadena, California as a shy and bookish young Black girl. At age 12, she says her inspiration to become a science fiction writer was that after she endured a B or possibly C, a science fiction movie called Devil Girls from Mars, she was convinced that she could write a much better story. And so she begged her mother for a typewriter, and her mother finally relented. That thus began her science fiction career. Now, she went on to earn degrees from Pasadena City College and Oakland and the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. In 2006, she died in Seattle, Washington, prompted by a tragic slip and fall. She began her writing career in 1970. The first of her novels were Pattern Master in 1976, was the beginning of her 5-volume Patternist series about an elite group of mentally linked telepaths ruled by Doro, a 4,000-year-old immortal African. Other novels in the series are Mind of My Mind, 1970, Survivor, 1978, Wild Seed, 1980, and Clay's Ark, 1984. Among her major works is Kindred, 1979, where a contemporary Black woman, Dana Franklin, is sent back in time to a pre-Civil War plantation, becomes an enslaved person, and rescues her white slave-owning ancestor For unless his life is spared, and in turn later on, he then rapes Dana's many greats grandmother, Dana's family tree will disappear. Clearly a heart-wrenching dilemma. Butler's later novels include the Exogenesis trilogy and The Parable of the Solar, The Parable of the Talents, and Fledgling in 2005. Butler eventually won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards, some of the greatest awards awarded to a science fiction author. And Butler became the first science fiction writer to be awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, or so-called Genius Award. And in 2000, she received a PEN Award for Lifetime Achievement. Now on to the parables. Again, the Parable of the Talents is the second book in Butler's Earthseed duology. It began as a dystopian, in a dystopian America of 2004, in which the Pox, a multiple climate, economic, health, social, and political crisis, has created great anarchy and reduced the US to a shell of its former global self. The husband of the protagonist, Franklin Bankole, explains the Pox in this way. I have read that the period of the upheaval that journalists have begun to refer to as the apocalypse, or more commonly or more bitterly the Pox, it lasted from 2015 to 2030, a decade and a half of chaos. This is untrue. The Pox has been a much longer torment. It began well before 2015, perhaps even before the turn of the millennium. It has not ended. I have also read that the Pox was caused by accidentally coinciding climatic, economic, and social crises. It would be more honest to say that the Pox was caused by our own refusal to deal with the obvious problems in those areas. We caused the problems, then we sat and watched as they grew into crises. I have heard people deny this, but I was born in 1970, Bankole says. I have seen enough to say that this is true. I've watched education become more of a privilege of the rich than the basic necessity that it must be if a civilized society is to survive. I have watched as a convenience, profit, and inertia excuse greater and more dangerous environmental degradation. I have watched poverty, hunger, and disease become inevitable for more and more people. He goes on to conclude, overall, the Pox has had the effect of an installment plan for World War III, unquote. Now, this story of the Parable of the Talents is told mostly from the perspective of the daughter of Lauren, Ola Olamina, and Franklin Bankole, where the daughter is narrating the writing of her mother and father, whereas Lauren, or Olamina, as she's often referred to, the main protagonist of the book, is a young woman in her 20s. Bankole, her husband, is in his 50s. And they say their improbable love springs from the mutual needs they have given the dystopia of their times. This is a not so future America where courts and legislatures have weakened the 13th and 14th Amendments so that indentured servitude is effectively legal and ties the impoverished to the more affluent. This sounds like today's human trafficking, prison labor, and sub-minimum wage fights, does it not? Only about half of the population in this America is fully illiterate or fully literate. This sounds like today's continued fights over public education and the rising cost of education. In this America, towns and cities are ravaged by climate challenges, and they only prosper if they are owned and protected by mega corporations. Today, we battle over climate change and neoliberalism. And one must pay fees in order to be served by a corrupt police force that often targets Black lives and Black people. Today's Black Lives Matter. Recall I said that Butler wrote these books in 1993 and 1998. Now, Lauren, or Olamina, as I will refer to, is a hyper-empath or sharer. Hyper-empaths have the unique ability of physically feeling or seeming to feel the pain of others that they witness, and some of the pleasure. This is particularly excruciating given Olamina constantly witnesses murder and rape throughout the novel. It is believed that Lauren, like others, biologically inherited this ability from her mother, who was addicted to a new drug called Prescient, a smart drug that was supposed to cure Alzheimer's. Now, if you've watched the film Planet of the Apes for my sci-fi fiction fans, this will sound very familiar. Around 2027, Lauren is forced to leave her working class walled community in Robledo, California, with because a group of paints, as they are called, or anarchists, who are drugged out on Prescient, attack her community, burn it to the ground, and kill most of her family, including her father, a Baptist minister. She and a band of refugees who eventually become her disciples, travel by foot to Northern California to establish a commune called Acorn, based on the religion that Olamina founds called Earthseed. The central tenet of Earthseed we've already discussed. God is changed. And its theology is that the destiny of human beings is to one day travel to the stars to create an extraterrestrial utopia. Olamina explains that she's derived this religion by simply deducing logical truths about the brutal world around her. In Parable of Talents, Olamina defended how she derived the tenets of her religion by stating, all the truths of Earthseed existed before I found them and put them together. They were in the patterns of history, in science, in philosophy, in religion or literature. Now, the central dramatic tension of this novel is that for Lauren, or Olamina, her followers have to overcome the oppression of US President Andrew Steele Jarrett, a Texas US Senator, and his brutal followers of his Christian America, CA organization, as they attempt to establish a hyper-conservative Christian theocracy that they believe will bring about the moral, racial, and gender order that America now needs. His campaign slogan is, you will guess, "Make America Great Again." Many observers have credited Butler with predicting or prophesying the rise of Donald Trump. But actually all she would say she did was did copious research and observed the rise of Ronald Reagan, among others, who used this variant of this slogan before Trump. Recall our opening reading about choose your leaders wisely. Among other realities, Butler said she simply observed what was happening with Proposition 187 in California that denied undocumented immigrants scores of services. Then she projected as to how the fear of the immigrant, the xenophobic fear of the other, would abet the ideas of zealots seeking to create a white Christian nation that fundamentally curtails citizenship rights. When is the past the prologue? Now, I won't tell you every twist and turn of the novel, although forgive my spoilers here and there, but my words are simply an invitation to further read the parables of Butler and others who possess political pressures. I assure you it's a gripping story in many ways and extremely difficult to read for those of you who have already read it. The key example is when the Crusaders, or the vigilante wing of Jarrett's Christian America, attacked Olamina's Acorn community, killed her husband and many others, placed collars or control devices around her neck and those of other community members, enslave her, rape her and other women of Acorn, take her newborn baby and hand her to a Christian American family while renaming her community Camp Christian. This happens around 2033 and halfway through the novel. Thus, the second half of this story is about how, despite the enormous odds, Lauren and some of her followers escaped Camp Christian to eventually proselytize many others in spreading Earthseed. Forgive me for the spoilers. But those who've commented on Butler's authorship and her science fiction writing, such as Kilgore and Samatra, write, her narratives can be grim and often tragic. Her characters are often uncomplicated paragons of good. Messiah's undetermined her characters are never uncomplicated paragons of good. Messiah is determined to lead their people from fear and oppression to light. Her view of the human prospect may ultimately be hopeful, but it's never sentimental. Resolution, if and when it comes, is hard. And you will see that tension if you read her novels. Olamina described her religion thusly. The problem with Earthseed has always been that it isn't a very comforting belief system. In conclusion, I'll provide you, however, with what I see as the difficult resolutions of Butler's Earthseed insights. For I believe Butler has, in many ways, imbued in this character, Olamina, some of her own beliefs. First, and I'll share these four tenets very quickly. First, we must remain watchful of the signs and guard against the possibility that the chaos of our present moment, the COVID-19 pandemic, economic inequality, racial and social injustice, are not exploited by the powerful forces who want to return to their vision of a new world order. When my students read this book, they read it mostly as a parable against a parable against religious zealotry and the rise of an anti-democratic theocracy. But I believe a more nuanced reading of Butler in this novel is when and where we see what she warned against in America as not just sort of religious zealotry, but a zealotry that serves as a thin cover to the underlying racism and white nationalism, corporate greed, a brutal patriarchic or misogyny that's running rampant, and a xenophobia against the immigrants and the other. All of this fuels this zealotry. Olamina described President Jared as both loved and despised. Many say, and she goes on to say, many in the country say they need a strong leader, a strong hand to bring back order, good jobs, honest cops, and free schools. Eerily familiar. Second, we need to understand that any pending downfall of the US may not come from any one specific crisis, but multiple unintended crises. Recall the pox as I described it in the beginning, which is truly disconcerting reading while we are in the midst of this pandemic. But it was simply not us attending to the whirlwind of problems that threaten democracy and the quality of life. Even now, we are seeing stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post that the slowing or declining rates of population, and in the US and in the world, have many causes: climate, disease, inequality, not just one. Third, we who believe in freedom need to recognize that prophecy or prescience could all be a matter of brilliantly reading the present sign of the times. Who are the prescient persons, most especially the women of color, who are among us now, who are clearly reading the signs that are both hopeful and cautionary? Are they Stacey Abrams, the once and future gubernatorial candidate of Georgia? Alondra Nelson, a Columbia University professor and Afrofuturist, who's the current president of the Social Science Research Council? Or Alicia Garza, Patrice Colores, or Opal Tometi, the founders of Black Lives Matter? Butler strongly suggests that we should continue to search for the prescient among us as we become more prescient and read the signs for ourselves. And lastly, we need to continue to believe that human progress is rooted in human growth. We need to metaphorically keep reaching for the stars. Butler once explained why she used the Christian biblical parable of the sower and the parable of the talents as the central themes of her otherwise powerful books. She said, the parable, quote, the parable of the talents is one of the harshest parables of the Bible, but then life can be harsh. Will we, human beings, use our talents, our intelligence, our creativity, our ability to plan, our delayed gratification to work for the benefit of the community and the human community and the humans among ourselves? Will we use our talents or will we lose them because Earth is finite? Consciously or unconsciously, we must decide in all of our intelligence and industry, we must choose to be more than, as Olamina says in the parable of the sower, smooth dinosaurs, unquote. So friends of UUC of Columbia, please keep planting, keep reaping from the signs you see, and then act upon them. God is change. Amen.